They say silence is golden, but for me, silence is just a wall. A thick, heavy curtain that I've lived behind for most of my life. Most people find peace in a quiet room, but for someone who's hard of hearing, that quiet is a blind spot. It's where the things that don't want to be found like to hide. I've learned to navigate life by watching the world move, reading lips, catching the subtle shifts and shadows and feeling the vibrations of the floor beneath my feet. I thought I had it figured out. I thought my neighborhood in southern Quebec was the kind of place where nothing ever really changes, where the trees bordering the forest were just a backdrop for a peaceful life. But a year ago, I realized that just because you can't hear a threat doesn't mean it isn't breathing right down your neck. It was that weird, hollow time just after the holidays. You know that feeling when the excitement of the new year has worn off and you're just left with the gray, biting cold of February? That's where I was. I live in this small suburban pocket that feels like it's being slowly swallowed by the woods. It's quiet, low-key really. Everyone knows everyone's business, or at least they think they do. It's the kind of place where you leave your back door unlocked while you run to the store. I liked that. It felt safe. It felt like a warm bubble in the middle of a frozen wilderness. But looking back, I realized that warm atmosphere was just a cover for how isolated we actually were. I have this dog, Monty. He's a Rottweiler Husky mix, which basically means he's a 60-pound ball of muscle and fur that never runs out of energy. He's more than just a pet to me. He's my ears. When someone's at the door, he's the first to feel the vibration. When the mailman comes, he's the one who lets me know. We have this routine where we hit the forest trails in the afternoon. It's our time to reset. That day, it was a Tuesday, I think. I just finished late lunch, the kind that makes you feel a bit sluggish, and I knew I needed to get moving before the sun started its early dive toward the horizon. The forest in winter is a different world. In the summer, it's full of rustling leaves and the hum of insects, things I can't hear but can definitely feel. But in February, it's a blank canvas. There was a fresh layer of snow that had fallen overnight, crisp, white, and untouched. It's a beautiful sight, but there's something eerie about how it dampens everything. I let Monty off the leash the second we hit the trail entrance. He went straight up ballistic, sprinting into the tree line, his dark fur a sharp contrast against the blinding white. I saw a few sets of boot prints and some yellow patches in the snow near the start of the path, so I figured a few neighbors had already been out with their dogs. Most people around here are early birds, though. By 3 p.m., the woods are usually empty. I decided to take a fork in the path I hadn't used in a while. I was feeling a bit adventurous, which, looking back, was my first mistake. I knew these trails like the back of my hand, or so I thought. This specific path led to a wide clearing, a spot I loved because it gave me a clear view of the sky. I'd brought along these binoculars I got for Christmas, heavy, high-end ones, hoping to catch a glimpse of some of the native birds that stick around for the winter. The air was so cold it felt like it was stinging my lungs, but the silence, that heavy, familiar silence, felt comfortable. At least, it did until I spotted something that didn't belong. I was scanning the tree line on the far side of the clearing when my lenses caught a flash of something bright. Not the natural gray of the birch or the deep green of the pines. It was blue, a harsh, plastic blue. I dialed in the focus and my heart skipped a beat. Tucked away in a dense cluster of trees was a makeshift shelter. A blue tarp draped over some fallen branches, weighed down by rocks and half buried in the snow. It looked lived in. There were scraps of trash nearby and a small blackened circle where a fire had been. My stomach did a slow roll. This wasn't a hiker's camp. This was someone's home, and it was way too close to my backyard for comfort. But the sun was starting to dip, casting these long, jagged shadows across the clearing, and I knew I had to get home. I whistled for Monty. Well, I made the motion, and we turned back. But as we started walking, Monty's vibe changed completely. He wasn't running ahead anymore. He was walking right at my hip. his ears pinned back, his nose working overtime. He was sniffing the trail with a kind of intensity I'd never seen before. I looked down at the snow, expecting to see our own tracks from 30 minutes ago. Instead, my breath hitched. Right there, overlapping my own footprints, was a fresh set of tracks. They were huge, way larger than mine, and they were heading in the same direction we were. My brain started doing the math, trying to find a logical out. There were no other forks, no other way onto this specific trail. Whoever made those tracks had to have passed me while I was standing in the clearing with my binoculars. They would have walked right past my back, not more than a few feet away while I was distracted. The realization hit me like a physical weight. Someone had been standing behind me in the middle of the woods, and because of my ears, I hadn't heard a single thing. Not a footfall, not a breath, not the rustle of a jacket. I was a sitting duck. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just another hiker who was being polite and didn't want to startle me. But the shadows were getting deeper now, turning that charcoal gray that makes everything look like a threat. I picked up the pace, my boots crunching into the snow, the only sound I could truly feel in my bones. And then Monty stopped dead. He didn't just stop. He planted his feet and started barking toward the trees behind us. I could feel the vibration of his barks through the leash I'd just clipped back on, a deep, rhythmic thudding that traveled up my arm. I turned around, squinting into the gloom, and that's when I saw him. He was standing maybe 3 feet away, just standing there. He was massive, at least 6'4", wearing charcoal snow pants and a white camo jacket that made him almost disappear into the birch trees. He had his hands buried in his pockets. He wasn't moving. He wasn't charging. He was just existing in my space. He was muttering something. His lips were moving, but the light was so low I couldn't catch the shapes. I couldn't tell if he was speaking English or French, or if he was even speaking to me at all. I felt like a total idiot. I'd left my phone on the kitchen counter like a rookie. I tried to signal to him, pointing to my ears and then at the darkening sky, trying to say, "I can't hear you and I need to go." He didn't react. He just kept muttering, his eyes fixed on mine with this blank, hollow stare that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and practically ran the rest of the way home, Monty growling the entire time. By the time I got inside and locked the door, it was pitch black out, 4:30 p.m., and the world had ended. I went through my normal routine, fed Monty, made some tea, tried to convince myself that the guy was just a local weirdo living in the woods, harmless, right? I went to bed early, hoping to sleep off the adrenaline. But at 3 a.m., the wall of silence I live behind was shattered by a different kind of sensation. I woke up to Monty licking my hand, not the "I want a treat" lick, but an insistent pressure. I checked my phone, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. I had a text from my neighbor sent 3 minutes ago. "Hey, is everything okay over there? Monty is going absolutely nuts. I can hear him from my living room." My heart sank. If my neighbor could hear him through 2 sets of walls and a yard of snow, something was very, very wrong. I realized then that Monty wasn't in the room anymore. I crept downstairs, the cold air of the house biting at my ankles. I found him in the kitchen, his body pressed against the glass of the patio door, barking with a ferocity I'd never heard. I walked toward him, my vision still blurry from sleep, trying to see into the backyard. Then the motion sensor light outside clicked on. My heart didn't just race, it stopped. There, standing on my patio, less than an inch of glass away from my face, was the man from the forest. He was still wearing that white camo jacket. He was just standing there, looking directly at me, his hands still in his pockets. He wasn't trying to break in, he was just watching. I didn't think, I didn't breathe. I grabbed my phone and texted 911. I think I broke a land speed record for typing. I grabbed Monty's collar and ran back upstairs, my mind screaming. I reached under my bed and pulled out the machete I keep for just-in-case moments. I'm a small woman. I've taken martial arts, sure, but I know how the world works. A 6'4" man who has spent the night tracking me through a forest isn't someone you fight. You survive them.
I sat on the floor of my bedroom, my back against the far wall, clutching that blade so hard my knuckles turned white. Monty was at my side, his hair standing up like a ridge along his spine. We sat there in the dark, and for the first time I hated the silence. I hated that I couldn't hear if he was breaking the glass downstairs. I hated that I couldn't hear if he was walking up the stairs. But then I saw it.
The nightlight in the hallway cast a faint glow into my room through the gap under the door. A shadow blocked it. Someone was standing right outside my bedroom. I watched that shadow, a dark, unmoving shape, and I waited for the handle to turn. I waited for the wood to splinter. My hands were sweating so much I was afraid the machete would slip. Minutes felt like hours. I was trapped in a silent cage, watching a shadow decide my fate. But the door never opened. When the police finally arrived, the shadow was gone. They found the patio door smashed, completely shattered. He had been inside the house while I was upstairs. But nothing was stolen. My laptop, my jewelry, my wallet, all untouched. He hadn't come for my things. He'd just come for me. The police found my back gate wide open, leading straight into the forest. They checked the blue tarp shelter I'd told them about, but it was empty. Whoever he was, he'd vanished back into the trees like he was part of the snow itself. I haven't gone back into those woods since. I stay on the paved roads now, under the bright street lights where I can see everything coming. I never got a follow-up from the cops. No arrests, no names, nothing. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is blowing off the forest, Monty will stand by the back door and low growl at the darkness. And I'm left wondering, if I couldn't hear him then, how will I know if he ever comes back? It was 2021, a year that felt like one long, blurry fever dream for most of us. For me, that day could be summed up in one word: hectic. Just a total, absolute mess. You know that feeling when you're working from home during the prime COVID days and the walls of your apartment start to feel like they're closing in on you? That was my reality. I was glued to my desk, trapped in a 3-hour Zoom meeting that felt like it was draining the literal soul out of my body. My extended family was already upstate, laughing and sharing a meal at my parents' place, while I was stuck staring at a pixelated screen, nodding at spreadsheets. By the time I finally clicked leave meeting, I was an hour and a half behind schedule. I had a 2-hour trek ahead of me through the dark, and I knew I was already the late one again. I remember standing in my kitchen, frantically filling 2 massive cups of coffee. Black, because I needed the caffeine to act like a physical jolt to my system. I figured I'd need every drop of that liquid energy just to stay awake on the road. But the second I stepped out my front door and the freezing air hit my face, I realized that the drive was going to be a lot more than just a test of my patience. It was going to be a fight. The world outside had transformed while I was stuck in that meeting. The wind was howling, a low mourning sound that seemed to rattle the trees, and the streets were barely even visible. It looked like the local plows had just given up for the night. There was at least 2 feet of fresh powder on the ground, and the sky was still dumping more, thick and heavy. I looked at my car, an old beat-up Hyundai that had seen way better days. It was a total clunker, honestly. No anti-lock brakes, no special winter tires, just a thin shell of metal and a heater that took 20 minutes to even start blowing lukewarm air. It was the absolute last vehicle you'd want to be in during a blizzard, but it was all I had. I cleared a small patch on the windshield, hopped in, and started the slow crawl out of my neighborhood. For the first few miles, I was forced to stay under 25 miles per hour. The car felt light, like it wanted to float off the road at every turn. But I've always been a bit of a lead foot. I'm that guy who thinks he's invincible behind the wheel.
So once I finally hit the highway and saw even a sliver of pavement, I pushed it. I kicked that old Hyundai up to 70. Looking back, that was my first big mistake. I was driving way faster than the conditions allowed, fueled by caffeine and the desperate need to just get to my parents' house and be done with the day.
I didn't roll into my parents' driveway until about 9 o'clock that night. They had already started dinner, obviously, but the atmosphere was warm and filled with that specific holiday chaos that makes you forget the world outside for a minute. We shared drinks, opened a few gifts, and I let myself relax. I was catching up with cousins I hadn't seen in ages, laughing about old stories, and completely losing track of the time. The outside world, the snow, the wind, the dangerous roads, it all just faded into the background. It wasn't until the house started to quiet down and people began putting on their heavy coats to leave that I realized I still had to make the return trip. By the time I finally walked out to my car, it was past midnight. Another foot of snow had piled up, burying my car up to the wheel wells. I was feeling a bit buzzed from the drinks. Nothing crazy, but enough to know I should have stayed on the couch. But I was stubborn. I just wanted to be in my own bed. I figured if I was careful, I'd be fine. I wasn't condoning it, I was just tired and making a series of bad calls that were about to catch up with me in the worst way possible. As I pulled away from the house, the silence of the night was heavy. The roads were completely dead. Not a single pair of headlights in sight. It felt like I was the last person on Earth. I was heading down a particularly winding residential road, a shortcut I'd taken 1,000 times before. I made the grave mistake of pushing my speed to 40, thinking I could handle the curves. But as the road began to bend, I felt that sickening sensation of the steering wheel going light in my hands. The car wasn't turning, it was sliding. I tried not to panic. I'd skidded before. I steered into it, downshifted, trying to find some kind of grip, but there was nothing but ice under those tires. I watched the tree line getting closer and closer, the headlights illuminating the thick trunks of the oaks. I remember the moment of impact, the loud metallic crunch of the frame, the sudden bang of the airbag deploying, and then nothing, but the smell of gunpowder and the sound of my own heavy breathing. I sat there in the dark, the car humming with a dying energy, stunned, but somehow alive. The hood of the car was completely buried in a massive snowbank, pinned against a thick tree. There was no way I was pushing this thing out. I was stuck. The first thing I did was call my roadside assistance, but the lady on the other end sounded exhausted. She told me that because of the storm, a tow truck wouldn't be able to reach my location for at least 40 minutes, maybe an hour. I was on a deserted stretch of road, surrounded by deep forest on both sides, with no houses for miles. I called my dad next, my voice shaking a little as the adrenaline started to wear off. He told me he'd hop in his truck and head my way immediately. I hung up, leaned my head back against the seat, and waited. The only sound was the wind whistling through the cracked window. But then something else broke the silence. It was a crunching sound, rhythmic, undeniably the sound of footsteps in deep snow. They sounded distant at first, muffled by the trees, but they were definitely there. My heart started to pick up speed. Who would be out here in the middle of a blizzard, on foot, in the middle of nowhere? I pushed the driver's side door open, the metal groaning as it scraped against the snowbank. I stood up, looking over the roof of the car into the darkness. The footsteps had stopped. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound over the wind. And that's when I heard it, a new sound. It's hard to even describe it without feeling a knot in my stomach. It was a wet, slurping sound, like someone was eating something messy or dragging something heavy through the slush. I looked toward the tree line, where the shadows were deepest. I could see a shape moving near one of the larger trees. It was dark as hell, but I was pretty certain I was looking at a person crouched down in the snow. I cleared my throat and called out a shaky, "Hello?" The slurping sound stopped instantly. No one called back. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold biting into my skin, but the figure didn't move or respond. It was just a dark mass in the trees. I officially lost my nerve, scrambled back into the car and slammed the lock button. My breath was coming in short, jagged gasps now. Not even a minute later, the footsteps returned. They were closer this time, circling the car. I heard a sharp clink against the passenger side window, like a rock or a frozen branch had been tossed at it. I couldn't see out of the glass because it was completely frosted over and covered in snow. I was trapped in a metal box, hearing someone or something patrolling the perimeter of my wreck. I couldn't just sit there. I had to know what I was dealing with. I opened my door again, stepping out into the biting wind. I checked the snow around the car and felt my stomach drop into my shoes. There were boot prints, fresh, deep impressions in the snow circling my car multiple times. They led right up to the passenger door and then trailed off into the dark woods. But that wasn't the worst part. Scattered in the white snow were dark, crimson drops. Blood. It looked like whoever had been standing there was bleeding profusely. I didn't even think. I reached into the glove compartment and grabbed my 9mm. I didn't care about the legalities or the what-ifs at that point. I felt like a hunted animal. I stepped away from the car, clutching the grip so hard my knuckles turned white, and began to follow the prints into the trees. As I walked, the blood spatters got larger, turning into thick, dark pools in the snow. I followed them past the first row of trees and saw a dark mass lying about 10 feet away. I was praying, literally whispering to myself that it wasn't a human body. I pulled out my phone, flicked on the flashlight, and aimed the beam at the pile. It wasn't a person. It was a deer, but it had been absolutely slaughtered. Its stomach had been ripped open with what looked like surgical precision, and the snow around it was stained a deep, horrifying red. But the thing that made me freeze in place was the neck. The deer had been completely decapitated. I swept the light around, looking for the head, but it was nowhere to be found. I'd seen enough. I turned around and sprinted back toward my car, my lungs burning from the cold air. I reached the driver's side door, yanked it open, and as soon as the interior light flicked on, I almost vomited right there in the snow. Lying right in the center of my driver's seat, where I had been sitting just moments before, was the severed head of the deer. It was positioned perfectly, propped up so that its glassed-over eyes were staring directly at the door, as if it was waiting for me to get back in. I didn't even close the car door. I just turned and booked it down the road, running as fast as I could in the deep snow. I ran for what felt like miles until I saw headlights cutting through the darkness. I waved my hands like a lunatic, still holding my gun, shouting at the top of my lungs. It was my dad. He slammed on the brakes, looking at me like I'd completely lost my mind. I scrambled into his passenger seat, shaking so hard I could barely speak, and told him everything. He looked at me with this blank expression. He literally didn't believe a word of it. He thought I'd hit my head in the crash and was hallucinating from the shock. I told him to drive back to the wreck, that I'd show him. I felt safer with him there, especially with his heavy truck and a second set of eyes. We pulled up to the Hyundai a few minutes later and got out. My heart was pounding against my ribs as we approached the open driver's door. The boot prints were still there, clear as day in the snow, circling the car. But when we looked inside, the deer head was gone. The seat was empty. The only thing that remained was a massive dark stain of blood soaked deep into the fabric of the seat. I looked toward the tree line where I'd found the carcass, and that was gone too. All that was left were wide, heavy drag marks leading deep into the woods where no vehicle could ever go. My dad didn't say much after that. I think seeing that blood on the seat was enough to make the reality of it sink in. The tow truck eventually showed up, and we watched in silence as they hauled my ruined car away. My dad asked if I wanted to call the police, but honestly, I was done.
I didn't have the energy to explain the deer-head man to a skeptical cop. I just wanted to sleep and forget that night ever happened. To this day, I have no idea who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe they just wanted to scare me. Or maybe, had I not stepped out to follow those prints, they would have finished what they started.